Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ross Fairley. I'm the lawyer on the panel today from the law firm Burgess Salmon. We've got a stand out there. So why is a law firm here? Well, we do a lot of transport and infrastructure across the piece, and not just highways, actually. It's interesting, we were talking just then, Philip, about decarbonising roads, but of course we've got a huge issue with aircraft and shipping, which you alluded to, and which is going to be, frankly, probably more challenging. I myself come from an energy background, so I head up the renewables and the environmental team. And those two sectors, transport and energy, are probably the biggest parts together of our business at Burgess Salmon. So it won't be a surprise to hear that this is a topic, and electric vehicles are a topic which is of interest to us and which we see as a natural area for us to be advising in. I am going to agree, I think, and so can be quite quick with a lot of what Philip has said. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And I guess I would make 3 points. I haven't got any slides. The first thing is, I'm a lawyer, so I probably have to go back to the law, because otherwise you'll be thinking, what the hell's he doing on a panel anyway? And what I would say on that is that there are an enormous amount of laws and legislation and policy coming out which are forcing and promoting the move to electric vehicles, the move to decarbonisation. And we mustn't forget that when we're here talking about electric vehicles, and I'm pleased that Philip mentioned heat and various other things, that electric vehicles are just one part of decarbonised transport. And decarbonised transport is just one part of our move to net zero. So it's a small part within a bigger part within a much bigger part. And we need to bear that in mind, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But we do have, as has been mentioned, the Climate Change Act. We have that commitment to net zero. Beyond that, we have reporting now on companies, much more stringent reporting around decarbonisation. We have the Autonomous Electric Vehicles Act. You can name a whole host of legislation that has been introduced to try and facilitate and encourage electric vehicles and set the groundwork that needs to be going forward. Building regulations at a basic level as well for new buildings. All good stuff. We've also got the move within companies over the last few years, and it really has actually been in the last few years. I mean, it's astonishing what's happened. We've had the Renewable Energy 100, which is the bigger companies choosing and saying and standing up and saying, we are going to source 100% of our electricity from renewable, and it's amazing what that has then triggered in terms of buying and promoting renewables projects. But we now have the EV 100, and that is going to force the same change. And if you can look at what's happened on the renewable energy buying side, if EV 100 works, that is going to be a major promoter. And of course, those companies buying the fleets and turning their transport into decarbonised transport will be a huge driver, and those vehicles will filter down into the public as well. So I've no doubt at all, going back to David's first point, that there's no doubt this is going to happen. I don't think there's probably anyone in this room that doesn't think it's going to happen, and I think it's going to happen very, very quickly. And in some ways, looking at our energy infrastructure, it's got to happen, because this is one of these rare events where there is such an unstoppable driving force, did you see what I did there, that the energy infrastructure will have to catch up. It will have no choice. Now, the question is, how easy will that be? How painful will that be? And will we get our act together to make it as the minimum pain as possible? I was in a talk over there with Tom Hurst from Fastned, who are a charging infrastructure provider as well, and he probably used the unfortunate phrase saying that once a few charging stations get going, once you have a few EVs, they've seen it in the continent, in the Netherlands, the whole thing is explosive. Not sure that was the right phrase, as I say, but his point was that the exponential growth is unbelievable, and it happens so quickly, and I can believe that. So that's the positive. It's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. I guess I would echo the comment that Philip's made about joined-up policy, and again, harking back to the law, joined-up legislation as well, because for as much as you promote and facilitate through the clean growth strategy, the industrial strategy, and say we want to be a leaders, we want to turn and decarbonise transport, we want to capture the innovation around transport and various other things. For every tweak you make there, sometimes it has very unnecessary and unwanted consequences in other areas which are probably just as important. And tweaking a policy here does not necessarily mean that that's going to prove to be fruitful if you're not adapting and looking at how that knocks on into other sectors as well. So the classic example was mentioned about renewable power. For the last 3 or 4 years, the onshore wind and solar industry has been in the doldrums in this country. We have not had a policy that's been supporting it. And yet now we have net zero, which says we've got to produce all of this renewable energy, which will be needed for heat and which will be needed for electric vehicles. So how has that fitted together over the last few years? We've had a policy historically, and I'm very happy to hear the panel on this, but of grid reinforcement when it's necessary, just in time, not this ahead of need policy, and that really does need to switch as well. Who's going to pay for that? We have got a policy that says we're freeing up now planning for storage facilities because we know we're going to need electricity storage on the network to strengthen the network in some areas and to cope with the renewable and intermittent generation that we produced. Yet at the same time, we're adapting grid charges, which has decimated the storage sector and the energy storage sector over the last few years, made storage projects just not viable. So there's a lot of knock-on consequences and policy that needs to be brought together and looked at holistically on that. And lastly, I guess the last point I'd make is we've talked about electric vehicles, and I know last year, Richard, we talked a little bit about cabs and autonomous vehicles. But I think in your future-proofing, I think we do need to factor in what is going to happen with cabs, autonomous vehicles, and vehicle-to-grid as well. It is a longer play, it is out there, but absolutely agree that we need to be considering what the impact of that will be when we're looking at the infrastructure we need now.
I did a thing about drones recently as well, which I'm assuming take a lot of charging. So it sounds like you're all sort of, yes, there are big barriers along the way, but you're fairly confident we can cope with those barriers with enough sort of effort. But then I guess, I mean, I don't know how much you would, because about 2 years ago I was doing one of these conferences and everyone was obsessed with Uber, like I was saying, because no one could see it coming and it suddenly came out of nowhere and it was affecting all of their business models, and there's always that danger that something comes along you can't predict, isn't there? But anyway, we'll come on to that in a second. We're going to get to the questions because a lot of them really reflect the kind of things I think we should be talking about. And cost, we're talking about barriers to people taking up electric cars. Cost is going to be a really key one. So there are two elements here. The first one I'll sort of deal with in terms of the inequity and social class, and then we'll get to one where literally the physical cost of filling up. So there's one here, electric cars are currently a luxury. When do we expect mass adoption? And then there was another one here as well, which I can't now find because it slipped down the order, but it was a very similar thing. How do we ensure that it's not just something for the wealthy people, that all social classes can get an electric car, can afford an electric car? So, well, David, why don't you start us off with that? When do we get to that point where, I know all of my friends who've got well-paid corporate jobs have got them, but no BBC people I know have, you know. So, you know, when do we get to that point where it's a genuine choice for everyone?
I think it's a matter of time, and I think what we're seeing is the automotive industry at the beginning of a production cycle, life cycle of EVs. I know there are going to be probably challenges from the audience about the cost of batteries and so forth, but it's like any product that comes to market, that the first part of that, if you like, the first implementation, when they're not producing in mass numbers yet, it is expensive. But as production methods change and as the numbers ramp up, then I think we'll see costs come down. Clearly, as opposed, if you like, to introducing new models, whether it's Golfs or Ups or Focus or Nissan Micras or whatever, then those models being introduced are really just piggybacking on existing market segments. What we do know is that the costs are already starting to come down. I think the other factor is, and it's an interesting one, particularly for UK industry, are the new entrants to the vehicle market. And there are a number of new entrants already, both in the commercial van and vehicle sector, but also, intriguingly, some very innovative work going on in the car sector. Designers, new startups utilising new materials to get the cost down and not have to rely on traditional production methods. The second element about the social accessibility is really a continuation of the debate we should be having already. About a third of the population don't own a motor car today. So they are reliant on, whether it's public transport or not, having to walk. I think what we'll see is, particularly with the increase in the number of car share and short-term rent and drop-offs capability, and we're seeing that to a degree amongst younger people in urban centres, where they're not actually buying cars, they're not leasing cars, they're simply utilising the transport during the week for commuting, getting to work or whatever, going to college, and then if they need to use some personal transport at the weekend, they will go and either do a short-term rent or do a car share or something like that. So I think the demographic isn't going to significantly alter because of EVs. It's just that we have an opportunity, because of the other systems around, mentioned MAS and others, actually to include and give people the option of a much wider range of transport. Notwithstanding, there will always be public transport, whether it's scheduled or on demand, will be available as well.
Philip, do you agree it's not really about whether VW bring out a cheaper electric Golf or whatever, because actually people won't own cars in the future and we're maybe thinking about it the wrong way?
I certainly think that's part of it, right? I think there are three things that feature here. The first is, you know, just about everyone that I've met that has driven an electric car says it's so much better than driving a internal combustion engine car. Why would I ever want to change now that I've gone there? So unlike many other aspects of the transition that we face, it doesn't feel like consumer acceptance from an experiential point of view is a problem. It feels like it's kind of an upgrade from an old phone to a smartphone, right? It's kind of cool and something that people want to do. Most car companies, the sort of the received wisdom at the moment, conventional wisdom, would suggest that we should be getting to roughly cost parity sometime between 2022 and 2025, and thereafter the anticipation has to be that as battery costs become get lower and lower and lower, and actually battery range becomes higher and higher and higher, any of those perceived value gaps will close. And it's also worth remembering that if people think and are pretty convinced that conventional internal combustion engine cars are going to be phased out at a given time, residual values are going to go through the floor. All right, so ownership costs of ICEs are actually going to go up compared with what we used to so far. The third thing is absolutely to David's point. I think we're living through the early phases of a significant shift in how we use and own and relate to cars. I used to work at BP. We were trying to do stuff around posh petrol back in the day, so poacher turned gamekeeper, and I was really struck then by the intensity of the emotional relationship that lots of people had with their car. It was part of their identity. That seems to be changing now. Cars are now deemed to be much more a utilitarian tool to get me from A to B, and people are thinking of it in sort of financial optimization and environmental optimization terms, rather than it being, you know, a core part of my personality, which was certainly the, you know, the mindset and the way of being that I grew up in when I was, so I think that's clearly happening.
Richard, I think one other point to make is that, of course, the cost of the car is, in a sense, the upfront element. If you take in the cost of ownership and the cost of running, then EVs, the business case becomes overwhelming. And whether that's a privately owned vehicle or whether that's a commercial vehicle, because the petrol, the insurance, the servicing costs are all of a different profile altogether. So, in a sense, if we are sticking with a leasing rental type model, then we should see those costs reducing over time, and in line with Philip's suggestion, and therefore that by itself makes accessibility a much more realistic thing. It won't be total, but it will become a much more realistic thing.
It's an interesting point. I'll bring Laura in on this one as well, because someone's actually written, is cost of electricity at charging points a barrier? Question mark. Paying 39 pence for a kilowatt hour is the same as running a 40 mpg car. So someone's suggesting at the moment that those running costs are not necessarily attractive to some people.
Yes, I think what we're seeing at the moment is the cost of charging at different areas, different locations, is kind of widely variable at the moment. I guess as a sort of, if you're charging on your driveway, that's a pretty clear business case. I think there's a bit of a learning curve with the kind of mass market here. So at the moment, some of the chargers reflect the fact that there's not that many vehicles charging there. So it's a bit chicken and egg. So I think my personal expectation is we'll see these propositions change significantly. I think the technology in the vehicles around making these charge points more visible than ever before will lead these tariffs to change significantly. And I'm expecting to see a lot more sort of variety in the different offerings. So whether it's a combined sort of parking plus charge tariff, we're even seeing trialing of free charging if you go to specific destinations, so supermarkets, retail outlets, etc. So I'm expecting to see a huge range of different offerings to suit different people. I mean, just building on the last question as well, from a personal perspective, in terms of the current cost of EVs, again, it doesn't cover everyone, but there are some kind of amazing offers out there at the moment. So talking about these new propositions, I've personally been part of a month-by-month subscription to an EV. And, that for me, personally, broke down that kind of cost of entry. It also enabled me to prove to myself that living in a terrace with no driveway, that I could actually charge. And I did make use of all these different propositions. So I think, you see some of these headlines, and then when you're actually in the position of how does it fit into my day-to-day life, how does it work for me, am I going to charge at work, you see the amount of offerings that are there, and we're just expecting that to grow and grow.
Ross, there's quite a few questions here about batteries, and I'll try and sort of paraphrase some of them. We've got one here. How do you address the environmental waste mountain of EV batteries as recently highlighted by the work of the University of Birmingham? There's quite a lot of questions about how green it is to develop these batteries, and then what do you do with them afterwards? What's the, how long do they hold their capacity? Second-hand markets, I guess, as well as, how long can you leave it before you buy an electric car and the battery isn't very good? Are we sort of thinking they're a bit greener than they are because there is this battery issue?
Yeah, there is a battery issue about what substances go into the batteries. Although there's a lot of research going on and there's adaptations around that to make them as friendly as possible. But there is an issue there in terms of the mining and various other things. There is an issue about the waste as well, and we've got we've had for a number of years EU directives on batteries and recycling and reuse of batteries, and there's a number of business models that are set up to make use of the electric vehicle batteries at the end of their life, put them into banks that can be used for a different purpose, may not necessarily be suitable anymore for the car, but they can still be used as a backup for generation. How successful that's going to be with banks of these car batteries, I couldn't say, and as I mentioned before, the whole battery storage market and the energy storage market at the moment is somewhat in the doldrums. I think it's a fair issue. It comes back to this point about saying you need to look at this holistically, and what are we doing about this? We make a change in one area, what impact does it have in another area? It probably leads me on to a point about innovation, because we've left a lot of, or government would like to leave a lot of the market and how EVs and the business and the supply chain around it come together to the market to decide. But the reality around that is that's good, but some of the regulations you've got in there don't actually encourage and help the new entrants into the market. It plays to the existing entrants, the existing energy suppliers, the existing oil majors who have all of the abilities to cope with the myriad of legislation that hinders you in-house already. And the new entrants can't get round that, and they find that to be a barrier. So we need to look at that. That said, you need to have boundaries within which the market operates, because the converse argument there is if you open everything up, you will end up, as we kind of did a little bit, I think, with the early stage chargers, with everyone just piling chargers in that don't talk to each other, that are of various different qualities, and we can't have that going forward. We've gone through that pain threshold. That needs to now be parked. Do you see what I did there again? And move forward.
David, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that's coming out of some of the research into looking at people who've had EVs for a period of time is that actually the cycles of usage on the batteries is showing they're not as heavily flogged, as it were, as people expected. So there's actually, even when they've been, when they're sort of reaching their end of life in an EV, there's still considerable capacity to use them in other aspects, whether that's for storage or some other use that people are developing. So I don't think it's it's a fair question and one we have to keep at the front of our minds, but there are signs that in the same way that driver behavior is changing, so we're beginning to see the impact of EVs in, after a period of a year or so, not actually burning out the battery so quickly. Sorry, there's that expression, burning out again.
So it is just worth noting that one of the things that's going on in the UK at the moment is we have something called the Faraday Challenge, a significant amount of public money that's gone into a range of research initiatives to try and leverage the fact that, the lithium-ion battery was invented in Oxford, right? We've got some great fundamental battery science and battery technology capability in this country. And one of the significant strands of the work there is around battery recycling and disposal. And so there's quite a lot of research happening around this challenge.
Final one I'm going to come to, actually. I can't find the question in here, but it's effectively about, are we putting all our eggs in one basket with electric cars and ignoring something like hydrogen, which might come along in the future? And people don't talk about hydrogen that much at the moment, but it is a possible alternative, isn't it? I mean, do you think that there is a danger we spend all of this money on electrical infrastructure and we're ignoring hydrogen, which might be the longer term solution? Yeah.
Well, first of all, the sort of the electricity stranded asset worry, given that we're likely to need to electrify many other parts of the economy anyway, I don't think that that's an issue that should concern us. In fact, I would argue that we should take advantage of the early move to electrification of transport as a way of providing us with a portal, a catalyst, to understand how we need to think differently about how we use our energy system so that it is good for other purposes in the future. So it's actually an opportunity, not a risk, in my view. On the matter of hydrogen itself, it may well be that some really interesting fuel cell vehicle technologies emerge. Let's see. I mean, the issue is always when something like one technology starts to get ahead and starts to scale up, it becomes that much more difficult for a challenger technology, even if it might be better, to elbow its way in. But on hydrogen itself, net zero means hydrogen has a huge role to play in our 2050 economy. The challenge that we have, and one of the things that the Energy Systems Catapult is worrying about is, so given that we need a lot of hydrogen if we are to particularly decarbonize heavy industry, right? We are going to create a whole new hydrogen manufacturing industry effectively from nothing. It's all got to be green. How quickly can that scale? How much green hydrogen can we actually produce in the time required? And then where will it have greatest value in the context of a decarbonized future? Just in terms of broad scales, today we use around about 400 terawatt hours of electricity. We think that by 2050, we'll need to have 200 terawatt hours of hydrogen capacity, brand new, all green in the system. That's either going to be made, we think, from electrolyzing renewable electrons and turning it into hydrogen, or by steam methane reforming natural gas, sequestering the CO2 underground, and then having the hydrogen as a result of that. Which of those technologies is going to win? I don't know. But for me, the fundamental challenge with hydrogen is less about whether or not they're going to be really amazing hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. It's going to be whether or not we can make enough of the stuff to be able to meet the varying needs that are going to be placed on it, the calls that are going to be placed on the hydrogen capacity we have in service of being a net zero economy in 2050.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think it's wonderful that we've got a number of companies, small companies, startup companies working on hydrogen vehicles. In a sense, it's got to coexist, and there will be certain use cases, certain duty cycles that are more appropriate for the use of hydrogen as a vehicle powertrain. The other aspect, I think, is in terms of, and Philip's touched on, in terms of providing power, electric power, is the use of hydrogen fuel cells alongside charging stations, particularly where there are multiple charging points, and using fuel cells, big fuel cells, I think is something which needs much more exploration, because it is something we're not thinking about. And that doesn't just apply to the electrification of the vehicle fleet, it applies right across the transport. So rail and trams is the same as thing.
Well, thank you for a really stimulating panel. Thank you for your questions.